the value of philosophy, we could have arguably begun with this, and I do like to spend a little bit of time here at the very beginning of the semester talking about this. Like I was saying, we could have arguably started with this even before the intro lecture and the logic stuff, just because of how important it is, right, and why we're spending any time on it at all. What I'm about to say is basically, right, if we can't establish any value associated with our subject, why spend any time, let alone, what are we going to be here, 4 months, 3.5 months, right, a whole semester? Why spend a whole semester studying a subject which we can't discern any value from, right? Why do that? And so that's really the impetus for us taking some time to kind of wrestle with this issue. What's interesting, and I think I mentioned this actually on maybe one of the first few slides, is this is arguably just as debatable as any other issue in philosophy, right? What is the value of doing philosophy itself? Is there any? Okay, is it, maybe there is some value to it, but maybe the detriments or the negatives outweigh that, right? So if you were to do a cost-benefit analysis, right, is it overall more useful or less useful, right? That whole question is kind of what we're interested in, why we spend a little bit of time, again, talking about the value of philosophy. Hopefully, after the lecture, you will feel like there is some value, right, and that we should continue. Despite, as we, in fairness, we will try to illuminate both sides, right, and consider maybe some reasons to question its value as well, okay? But we'll see kind of both sides, and again, hopefully be able to establish some reason to keep doing what we're doing, right? Some value in philosophy. I mentioned Bertrand Russell. I fleetingly kind of alluded to him towards the end of the intro lecture when we got to the contemporary era. He's one of the arguably the most well-known contemporary philosopher. So he's a British analytic philosopher. There you have his dates up there. So 1872 to 1970. We talked about kind of the correlation. For whatever reason, there seems to be this correlation between philosophers and this aptitude for math, and Russell is another good example of that. He was well known as being a pretty good mathematician, a logician as well. He made major contributions and discussed logic a lot. So, and again, just to reiterate that middle bullet point there, as mentioned in lecture 1, he is probably the most notable analytic philosopher and belonging to the contemporary era. This excerpt that we read comes from the Problems of Philosophy, written or published in 1912. And I was actually chatting with the other full-time philosophy faculty member that we have. He teaches over at the Blue River campus. And we were chatting, and we were talking about, he actually mentioned how this could actually serve, this Problems of Philosophy book by Russell, could actually serve as like a textbook for an intro to philosophy class. And I've always actually had that kind of thought myself, because he does such a good job of like simplifying the basic philosophical issues that we will encounter ourselves throughout the course. He does such a good job of like simplifying those and making it very accessible, these very complex, difficult problems, making them very accessible to average everyday people. And he really does kind of offer a broad survey of most of the essential philosophical issues. So that is a great book, and it's fairly short as well. So if you're ever bored and you're kind of getting into some of this stuff, I would highly encourage you guys to take a look at The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Okay, so let's move forward though. What question is he raising? And we kind of already alluded to the issue here. What's the value of our subject? All right, what is the value of philosophy? As I mentioned, I already kind of spoke to this. This seems like a good question to ask, especially early on, right? If we can't come up with or ascertain any value in doing philosophy, then why do it? Okay, so hopefully, like I said, we will be able to establish some value. Okay. And I mentioned this already as well, but this is arguably just as interesting and debated of an issue in philosophy as any of the other issues in philosophy. Just how useful, if at all, is philosophy. Maybe it does have some benefits, like I said, but maybe it also has disadvantages, in which case the question then is like, well, which outweighs the other? Right? So at any rate, that's kind of what we're going to try to examine here moving forward. So again, trying to be fair here, Okay, I'm obviously biased. I've studied this, done this all my life. But there are some, I would say, legit maybe questions or reasons to question the value of philosophy. You know, one of the, and I think I've already alluded to this kind of complaint about philosophy, and I inevitably hear it myself somewhat frequently. This, you know, people lamenting that it's not practical. You know, what does this get us? There's no definitive answers, as Russell will also say. We'll see here shortly. So what is this getting me? It doesn't seem practical, right? How does this apply to my everyday life? Now, I try to suggest, I think, right, that even if we don't get, and we shall see, maybe we will get the big T, capital T truths, right? Maybe we will get some definitive answers. Who knows, right? But even if we don't, right, get the so-called truth, right? If we can't quite find it, right? We're still training and doing philosophy, I would argue, right? We're still training our minds to think analytically, right? To become more conscious in our belief formation, to think critically, right? That's philosophy, what philosophy is sort of all about, right? To go off autopilot and start making this thinking belief formation process more explicit. That's kind of what philosophy is all about. So I would argue that it very much actually is practical, even though we might not get those big answers we're looking for. We're still training our minds to think a certain way, more critically, analytically, et cetera, which then I would argue is applicable, and I think I've made this case, in all walks of life, right? So when you get that suggestion for your 17 repairs on your car, if you take a philosophy class, you know, where you've been thinking more critically throughout the course, you're more apt to maybe question some of that versus how likely you would have been to question it before or without some exposure to philosophy. So hopefully, you know, again, I'm used to this kind of complaint or this suggestion that philosophy is not practical. And for sure, I mean, I can appreciate the complaint. It's not as clearly, you know, practical for sure as, you know, other disciplines. But hopefully what I was saying there, I still think you can make the argument that it is practical, that it does apply to, you know, arguably all facets of our life. But again, you know, I can appreciate how it doesn't seem as practical as other disciplines, and Russell, you know, recognizes this complaint as well. As he puts it on page 55 of the excerpt, quote, many men under the influence of science or of practical affairs are inclined to doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless, trifling, hair-splitting distinctions and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible. And I really can sympathize with this complaint as well. The further it kind of into philosophy you get, the further up, so to speak, the more nuanced it becomes. It really does kind of become like this process, like where you're writing something that's to just like a few people around the world that are going to even appreciate the, you know, the niche that you're discussing. And there are these kind of elaborate, crazy distinctions sometimes, and it's like, you know, who is even reading this, much less following this? So I can appreciate, you know, some of these kinds of remarks about philosophy. Okay, so there's this general complaint again that it's not practical or seemingly as obviously practical as, you know, other disciplines. Okay, so number two, this one also I can appreciate and resonates to a degree. There's this argument that philosophy might make us unhappy, or as I put it here somewhere, that it might be depressing, a depressing sort of process. Yikes. So the way I like to kind of frame this complaint, if you will, or this suggestion is, we've all heard of this notion, ignorance is bliss, yeah? Yeah, okay. Well, if you think about it, you know, is that really true? Maybe it is. And there's been, and as we progress throughout the semester, we will see, you know, through various philosophers' arguments, the implication on the part of some of them, they do think there's some truth to this, right? We'll see Nietzsche at the very end of the semester kind of implying as much, okay? In which case, if this is true, ignorance is bliss, what's the implication? It seems to suggest that these are divergent paths, right? If you're going to go and seek one, then you're not going to be able to go and get the other one. Okay? Someone who says this or thinks this is basically implying this. Right? Now, maybe they're wrong. Okay? Maybe it's the case that the only real path to happiness is maybe finding the truth. Maybe these are actually the same path. But the notion that ignorance is bliss seems to suggest this, that they're divergent. Right? If you want bliss, i.e. happiness, then you better, right, not have this, but the opposite, right? Because ignorance is the lack of this, right? Everybody knows what ignorance means, okay? So philosophy, in some sense, is trying to remove this, right? We want the truth, the opposite of ignorance. Well, if ignorance is required for bliss, and philosophy is trying to remove that, do you guys see what's the suggestion then? Right? The more philosophical we get, we might remove or eliminate some of this and get further down the path of truth, but it seems the suggestion is we'll be more removed from this then. Okay? So the buyers, the believers in this sort of mantra, right, they would suggest, okay, I guess you're going to need to pick, right? Do you want, what's more important to you? And Nietzsche, by the way, again, is one who seems to suggest this is true, and he says this path's the more important one. He chooses that path. But yeah, so people that are buying into this are basically going to suggest if you want happiness, your best bet is to drop this, don't do this please, drop this course, right, and go back to autopilot. Stop thinking, stop analyzing, just act on your natural programmed instincts, or however you want to put it, autopilot, right? Stop thinking critically, stop being philosophical and analyzing things, right? And that's your best bet to actually experience happiness or bliss. Everybody kind of get that kind of idea, whether you agree with it or not. And that is something that, maybe we will discover or sort of form an opinion on as we progress throughout the semester. And we will kind of revisit that. Like I said, there'll be various readings and so on. Some of these thinkers will kind of make references to this, and so we'll revisit this. But the general idea is maybe philosophy leads to, right, misery or a lack of this. And that kind of would make sense if this is really the case. Okay, now, I'm not saying this is the case. Okay, but if that is the case, then that might present a huge problem for philosophy. Maybe not, though. Even if this is the case, maybe this is still the right way to go. And so you shouldn't be dropping, even if this is true. Right? Because maybe truth should win out over happiness. Anyway, does everybody kind of appreciate that? Okay. So I think I mentioned that. And we do have, the very bottom there of the slide, examples throughout the history of philosophy of various thinkers kind of having nervous breakdowns. And Nietzsche is the most, I think, obvious example. He spends the last 10 years of his life in asylums or under the care of his mother and sister. So in other words, 1890 through he died in 1900, all 10 of those years, the last years of his life, he was basically in an asylum, like I said. So John Stuart Mill also has a breakdown in his early 20s, which it's really interesting. He reflects back on that nervous breakdown in his autobiography. And I think we will reference that later in the course when we introduce John Stuart Mill in more depth. But he's another example of a really pretty well-known philosopher who, had a breakdown for some time anyway. Kierkegaard, William James, all these guys are pretty well-known thinkers who struggled, at least at times, right? With bouts of depression or unhappiness, however you want to put it. Okay, so we've acknowledged a couple possible issues or reasons to be suspicious about the value of philosophy. Any questions on either of those? Okay. Let's get into Russell's characterization of philosophy, which I put on our roadmap right here. Okay, so what kinds of things does Russell say about philosophy? It's certainly a unique discipline, right? It stands out and it's different from other disciplines. How so? Do you guys remember? I wouldn't, different branch of science, I wouldn't even characterize necessarily philosophy as science, but I know, generally you're correct, right? That this idea that once it starts to solicit definitive answers, then it becomes a completely unique or its own discipline in itself, right? So psychology or some examples, astronomy, et cetera, et cetera. I think Russell gets into that actual example, right? But as soon as you start getting something resembling definitive answers, it ceases to be philosophy, he says. So you get this idea from Russell that by definition, philosophy dabbles in things that aren't definitive, that we don't have concrete answers for. So that's right here. All right. So yeah, excellent. That's definitely one of the major things that stands out. Some other things here, and we'll get into, I guess we'll just go ahead and progress through the slides here. He says it's only indirectly valuable to those who aren't studying it, right? I would push against this a little bit. I mean, his general point is definitely appreciable. So like the products of, say, the physical sciences or these other disciplines, right? Like a calculator, okay? That's something, regardless of whether you're studying the disciplines that generate or produce the calculator, right? All of us are directly affected by those sciences insofar as we're utilizing calculators and so on, the things they produce. And the suggestion is philosophy isn't like that, right? It doesn't have as much of a direct impact, I guess you might say, on those who aren't involved in the discipline itself. So non-philosophers aren't as directly affected by the discipline as some of these other disciplines. Does that make sense? Or at least that's his suggestion. Now I would push, and I guess, okay, let me preface what I'm about to say by saying I do generally appreciate the broader point, right? There does seem to be a sense in which these other disciplines have more palpable, tangible effects, right? But if you think about it, I would argue that philosophy can still be almost just as directly valuable. All right? Let's say somebody's maybe really getting into Buddhism, for example, and they start, one of your best friends, let's say, who used to be really difficult and you would always kind of get in arguments maybe. Suddenly he or she starts studying Buddhism, starts meditating a lot, and you see this kind of shift in their demeanor, right? It really starts to affect them. And you start getting inquisitive yourself, and you're like, yo, what's gotten into you, right? And it's affecting kind of your relationship. You guys don't argue as much. You become really interested. How did you become so patient? Blah, blah, blah. You become curious yourself, and pretty soon before you know it, you're looking into Buddhism yourself. Like, how is that not affecting you? In seemingly almost just as significant of a way. I would say that it can be seemingly just as directly impactful, right? You read some of these profound philosophical theories, it can inspire people to do all kinds of significant things, right? Inspire revolutions and so on. So I get the general point, but I would argue that philosophy certainly has the ability to be, at times at least, just as directly impactful as these other disciplines. Okay, so again, one of his points, right, that it doesn't, generally speaking, seem as directly valuable to those not involved in the discipline. Okay, does that point make sense? Okay. So this kind of goes with, I would say, he mentions how the benefits of philosophy are kind of psychological or good for the mind. This kind of, I think, parallels the point about how it's not practical, or it's thought to not be practical, right? So the benefits, insofar as there are benefits, they're not like as practically obvious, right? They're goods, they're mental kinds of goods, if you will. And he says, like, a lot of people don't even have kind of an awareness, much less an appreciation of those sorts of benefits or goods. And so they're not going to appreciate then what philosophy has to offer, right? If they're only kind of aware of and appreciate practical, sort of more tangible benefits, then they're going to be less inclined to, again, recognize and appreciate what philosophy has to offer. Okay? And so that's what he says on page 56 when he says, quote, "It is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found. And only those who are not indifferent to these goods can be persuaded that the study of philosophy is not a waste of time." So it has a very kind of specific type of benefit, right? A mental sort of benefit. Again, its benefits aren't as, say, tangible as some of these other disciplines. And then we already mentioned this earlier. Maybe one of the most noteworthy features of philosophy is that it doesn't seem to generate definitive answers. So one way, maybe I want to put this up here. This is kind of my own distinction. One way that's kind of helped me capture what philosophy, or one way to sort of present what philosophy is up to, is to offer the distinction between, say, negative knowledge and positive knowledge. And what I mean by this, and we're going to see that Socrates and the idea of Socratic wisdom, and we'll be introduced to that in the next couple of lectures, it's going to parallel exactly what Russell is suggesting and how he's characterizing philosophy, right? Philosophy doesn't offer these definitive answers. Instead, so why do philosophy? Well, what it does maybe garner or get us is a greater awareness. Maybe in doing philosophy, we kind of do get closer to the truth because we become more aware of our ignorance, right? Of all the things that we actually don't know. Whereas before, when we were on autopilot, we were just confident we knew all these various things, right? When philosophy shines the light on the fact that maybe we don't have all these answers. So it's kind of a negative knowledge, a knowledge of what we don't know. It enhances that, makes us more aware that we aren't the end-all, be-all of everything. We don't have all the answers. Maybe we don't even have any answers. Okay? We're not the center of the universe. And it wakes us up to the fact that there is a much grander, mysterious universe out there, right? Full of mystery that we should be questioning and thinking about. Okay? So versus what I mean by positive knowledge is like having these definitive answers, right? This is what happens after we die. This is why there's something and not nothing. So maybe we don't get that sort of knowledge. Instead, right, we become more aware that we don't know what comes after death, right? Or we don't know why there's something and not nothing. Okay? So it's kind of a weird kind of notion, right? In some sense, it gets us closer to the truth by illuminating how little of the truth we actually know. Does that make sense? And so Socratic wisdom, by the way, which we'll flesh out in much greater detail in the next few lectures, is the idea that, who are the truly wise people? The ones who acknowledge their dummy heads, the ones that appreciate how stupid they are. That I already relay to you guys the whole Socrates, and we'll get into like the tale of Socrates. But he finally reluctantly concedes that he's the smartest one on earth after like spending decades trying to find someone smarter. And what was it that made him smarter? The whole idea of Socratic wisdom? His actual appreciation and that he knew nothing, right? He was the only one that was fully aware of just how little he knew, right? Everyone else shared the shortcoming of thinking they knew things that they didn't, okay? So that's what put him one up, is that greater awareness of not knowing things, right? Whereas everybody else on autopilot thinks they do know all these things, okay? Or at least some things that they don't. Okay. So again, Russell certainly paints the same sort of image of philosophy as we get from Socrates and the idea of Socratic wisdom. Okay. As he says, quote, and this is from 56, "It cannot be maintained that philosophy has had any very great measure of success in its attempts to provide definite answers to its questions." And it certainly stands out. It's different from other disciplines in that sense. Okay. So, and I kind of got into this, right? The whole idea that maybe philosophy, really what it's about is, again, shining a light on all the stuff we don't know. And we do that primarily through asking good questions and realizing we don't have the answers to them. And I like the bullet point at the very bottom. In some sense, philosophy is more about, ultimately, it becomes more about asking questions than necessarily providing answers. Okay. And again, so philosophy for Russell, that top bullet point is a process, right? What's involved? It's a process of gradually acknowledging our place in the universe, right? And that we're not the center of it, so to speak, right? And acknowledging and realizing, again, the limits of our knowledge maybe and our ignorance to some extent. So Protagoras, maybe you guys hadn't heard of him, but you might have heard of the adage, man is the measure of all things. Have you guys heard of that? Man is the measure of all things. Pretty famous kind of saying. So Protagoras, another ancient thinker. Russell, or not another, he was an ancient thinker that said that. Russell is going to kind of be at the opposite end of the spectrum there, right? He doesn't like that mentality that engenders, this notion that man is the measure of all things, that we sort of dictate everything. That it kind of suggests that we are special and that we do have, right, knowledge, okay, and that knowledge depends on us. We're the measure of all things. And Russell basically intimates that actually philosophy gets us to realize the opposite. Philosophy properly understood is going to do the opposite. It's going to wake us up to the fact that we don't know everything, that we're not the center of the universe, right? When we're on autopilot, we go through life, right, and we think that, right, all we're kind of aware of is our everyday life, everything that's right in front of us, right? So it's like, I don't know, this kind of analogy's helped me, right? So there's this big old room here, a big old universe, but if we stay focused on just our finger, right? We lose sight of it. And that's basically what's going on in our everyday lives without philosophy. We're running on autopilot, right? We're consumed by our everyday lives. We don't have any appreciation, or really awareness, much less appreciation, that there is this greater mysterious universe, right? Because we're so bogged down in our everyday, the minutiae of our everyday lives, living on autopilot, right? And what Russell's suggesting is that philosophy wakes us up, right? It makes us aware that there is more, right, to life, to existence, than just what's right in front of us in our everyday lives, okay? It makes us aware that we really don't know what's going on, okay? We're not the measure of all things. We're a little speck, right, in this huge universe, and we know very, very little about it. Okay? Not to suggest we're not important. Okay? We don't want to go too far, right? But it makes us kind of, it's humbling. I like the way I put it somewhere here. Right? It's humbling. It makes us aware, maybe for the first time, right, that we really don't have some of these answers. Okay, so I would argue again, Russell is pretty much at odds with this notion from Protagoras that we're the measure of all things. No, philosophy makes us aware that we're not. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns so far? Okay. So again, this is implied by everything we've been saying, but philosophy is not about establishing and dwelling on our own personal circumstances, which we already do when we're just on autopilot. Right? Outside of philosophy class, this is how we generally behave, right? We just are consumed by our everyday goings-ons. Okay? And philosophy, again, is about waking us up to the fact that there's more going on. There's a huge universe around us that's very mysterious, that we don't have the answers, all the answers for, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it enlarges our, as I put it on the slide, enlarges our scope of consciousness, right? It makes us aware of more, you might say. And so at the bottom, it's a process by which we then begin to question maybe things that we just took for granted before. Okay? Instead of just supporting them on autopilot, we start questioning them. And that, maybe you could argue, is what leads to maybe some of the depression, right? Because you start to realize that some of the things you took for granted all throughout your life aren't as solidified, right, or defensible as you were supposing when you were on autopilot. Okay? And then maybe that can be a kind of depressing process, realizing how little you know. Maybe that's part of what adds to, if it is indeed a depressing process, maybe that's part of the reason why. So the value, if we're going to try to spell it out, is it does kind of wake us up. And it broadens our conscious horizon, right? We're no longer, thanks to philosophy, it wakes us up. When we are taken off autopilot, we back up, right? We have a wider purview, and we realize more things in the room, right? Besides just our finger, right? Or we realize there's this greater universe beyond just our everyday lives. Okay? So it broadens our conscious horizon in that sense. As Russell says, quote, philosophy has its value, perhaps its chief value, through the greatness of the objects which it contemplates, and the freedom from narrow and personal aims resulting from this contemplation. Okay, so again, it's freeing in that sense. And it makes us aware, so number two, it kind of makes us, what's the right word? More accepting, right? We are, I can't think of the right word, right? More accepting of other views, right? We're not as dead set on certain ways, okay? So it makes us aware, number two there, by questioning kind of the status quo and kind of what we just blindly accepted on autopilot. It makes us aware then that there are these other views available. There are other ways of looking at life, at various aspects of life. There are other ways of doing things, etc. Okay, and again, philosophy can make us aware of those things that we weren't previously aware of. Quote, philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. Okay, so free them from the tyranny of just going through life on autopilot, blindly endorsing whatever tradition suggests or whatever mom and dad suggest or whatever is popular in society at the moment. Right? Pojman and Vaughn, the editors of our textbook, basically echo Russell, so I'm just taking a moment here to suggest that as well. They put it in terms of it being philosophy, that is, being revolutionary and then liberating. So as they suggest it's revolutionary in the sense that it questions our normal ways of thinking. Again, kind of echoing what Russell already said, okay, and our norms that we were just accepting maybe blindly at times before, right? Well, we start to question that stuff and maybe rebel. Okay? Quote, its deliverances often disturb our common sense or our received tradition. Okay? So we're going to start questioning that stuff. And it's liberating. It enlightens us as to the other possibilities beyond what we grew up with, right? Or beyond the tradition. There are these other traditions maybe that we weren't previously exposed to, right? It's going to, again, put those on our radar. And in that sense, it's liberating. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, well, we do want to reflect a little bit. So we tried to acknowledge both the pros and the cons, you might say. Okay, and maybe there's a little bit to be said maybe for both. Maybe there is some negative associated with doing philosophy, but hopefully the positive outweighs it. I'm certainly of that opinion. But what are your thoughts? So what's interesting here is we should maybe revisit these questions at the end of the semester, because maybe your views on these questions might change after going through philosophy more extensively. But for now, okay, question 1, so when you're in your groups, right, reflect on these questions. What are your initial thoughts regarding the value of philosophy? If you had to say on a whole, whether it's more beneficial or on a whole not good for us, which would you pick, right? So granted that maybe it's a little bit, it has some benefits and it has some negatives. Would you say on a whole it's better viewed as a kind of cure and good for us, or on a whole it's better viewed as a kind of poison and not good for us? Okay. And then is it worth studying? I guess this would kind of piggyback off that last question then, right? Is it ultimately worth studying? Okay, and if you think, hopefully you think it is, and you're not going to just drop the class right after this session. But if it is worth studying, in what sense, right? How should it be incorporated in the educational system? What's interesting, I don't remember if it was this section that I mentioned this point to, or it was a different one, but over the years, it's become less and less ingrained in the educational system. For whatever reason, in my view, that's not good. But it used to be required, like decades ago, right? Philosophy was oftentimes required in high school, various high schools, okay? So if you are of the opinion that philosophy is a good and that we should be incorporating it into the educational system, in what capacity then? Should we be introducing it in kindergarten, first grade? Maybe wait until middle school? Or maybe high school, or maybe not at all. Maybe it's a poison, so we shouldn't even be here right now in college doing it. So what are your thoughts on that? So go ahead and break up into your groups and reflect on these two questions, and we'll reconvene and share our answers here in a little bit.